The history of American folklore is replete with tales of the inexplicable, yet few accounts possess the sheer volume of corroborating evidence and historical documentation as the events that plagued the settlement of Red River, Tennessee in the early 19th century. Before we delve into the darkness that consumed the Bell family, consider the image of a prosperous farmer lying on his deathbed in 1820, poisoned by a force that no medical professional could diagnose, while a disembodied voice laughed and sang drinking songs from the empty air above him. This was not a mere campfire story, but a documented siege upon a respected household that drew the attention of generals, clergy, and skeptics alike. Hello, and welcome to NightLine Podcast. I am Night, your host into the shadows of history. Today we open the files on the most aggressive and well-recorded poltergeist haunting in United States history, the Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee. This narrative is grounded in the historical record, specifically drawing from Martin Van Buren Ingram's An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch, published in 1894, which compiled the diaries and eyewitness testimonies of those who lived through the terror. To understand the horror that befell the Bell family, one must first understand the environment of the Tennessee frontier in 1817. The Red River settlement, now known as Adams, was a community forged by hard labor and strict religious adherence. It was a time when a man's survival depended on his agricultural output and his reputation within the church. John Bell Sr. was the epitome of this frontier success. A North Carolina native, he had moved his large family to the rich bottomlands of Tennessee to secure their financial future and establish a lasting legacy. He was a deacon at the Red River Baptist Church, a man of significant acreage, and a figure of authority whose estate planning seemed impeccable. The Bell farm was a model of efficiency, a tangible asset that should have guaranteed stability for generations. However, the social fabric of the frontier was woven with superstitions and interpersonal conflicts that could not be resolved through simple arbitration or standard legal proceedings. The catalyst for the haunting is often traced back to a business dispute, a matter that today might involve complex litigation or breach of contract lawsuits, but in 1817 was settled with grudges and curses. John Bell had entered into land dealings with a neighbor named Kate Batts, a woman known for her eccentric behavior and volatile temper. The dispute centered on the purchase of land and slaves, with Batts accusing Bell of usury and financial deception. While the community largely sided with the respected John Bell, Kate Batts swore vengeance upon him and his bloodline. This conflict serves as the crucial prelude, a reminder that even in a society governed by faith, the breakdown of human relations can open the door to forces that defy the laws of physics and estate law. The haunting did not begin immediately, but the seed of malevolence had been planted in the soil of the Bell farm, waiting for the right moment to germinate into a nightmare that would challenge the sanity of everyone involved.
The encroachment of the supernatural into the Bell household began not with a scream, but with subtle anomalies that tested the family's perception of reality. In the late summer of 1817, John Bell encountered a strange animal while walking through his cornfields. He described it as having the body of a dog but the head of a rabbit, a biological impossibility that vanished instantly when he fired his gun at it. This was not a hallucination induced by stress or fatigue, but a physical manifestation that signaled the beginning of the intrusion. Following this, the family began to experience auditory phenomena that escalated in intensity each night. It started as a scratching sound against the exterior weatherboarding, resembling a large rat gnawing at the structural integrity of the house. The sons would run outside to catch the intruder, only to find the yard empty and the night silent. As weeks turned into months, the sounds migrated from the exterior to the interior of the cabin. The scratching evolved into heavy knocking, the sound of invisible chains being dragged across the floor, and the distinct noise of a choking, gasping breath originating from the corners of the room. This phase of the haunting caused immense psychological distress, as the family struggled to maintain a facade of normalcy during the day while living in a state of siege at night. They kept the events secret, fearing that public knowledge would damage their social standing and perhaps affect the value of their property or their standing within the church. However, the entity soon grew bored with mere noise and escalated to physical assault. The primary target of these initial attacks was the youngest daughter, Betsy Bell. The accounts detail a harrowing experience where the young girl would scream in the night as her hair was violently pulled by invisible hands. Her bed covers were ripped off by a force strong enough to resist the grip of her brothers. Residents reported seeing red welts and handprints appearing on her skin without any visible assailant. This was physical battery committed by an unseen perpetrator, leaving the family helpless. John Bell, a man accustomed to controlling his environment and protecting his dependents, found himself unable to secure the safety of his own home. The entity displayed a distinct intelligence. It knew when the family was asleep. It knew who was in which room, and it seemed to derive pleasure from their terror. It was no longer a mindless energy, but a predatory presence that had taken residence within the domestic sphere, turning the sanctuary of the home into a prison. The psychological toll was equivalent to a severe personal injury case where the victims suffer long-term trauma, yet there was no authority to whom they could appeal for relief.
By 1818, the secret could no longer be contained. The entity had gained enough power to produce human speech, a development that shifted the haunting from a terrifying nuisance to a theological crisis. The voice was initially a low whistling sound that gradually formed into intelligible words. When asked to identify itself, the entity gave various conflicting answers, sometimes claiming to be a Native American spirit disturbed by the settlers, and other times explicitly stating, "I am Kate Batt's witch, and I am determined to haunt John Bell to his grave."
This confirmation of the curse solidified the connection between the past land dispute and the current horror. The entity, which the family and neighbors began to call Kate, displayed an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible, often quoting scripture to mock the pious observers who came to pray for the family. It could repeat verbatim 2 sermons preached at the same time, miles apart, demonstrating a form of omnipresence or remote viewing that terrified the religious community. The fame of the Bell Witch spread throughout Tennessee, eventually reaching the ears of General Andrew Jackson, the future President of the United States. Jackson, a man of iron will who had faced British armies and duelists, decided to visit the Bell farm to investigate the claims. The historical accounts describe Jackson's wagon train approaching the property when it suddenly came to a halt. The wheels were locked by an invisible force, despite the horses pulling with all their might and the road being smooth and level. After checking the mechanics and finding no physical obstruction, no broken axle or brake failure that would require roadside assistance, Jackson exclaimed that it must be the witch. Instantly, a metallic voice rang out from the bushes, telling the general that they could proceed and that she would see them later that evening. This interaction with a national figure lends significant credibility to the narrative, moving it beyond local folklore into the realm of national history. During Jackson's visit, one of his men, a self-proclaimed witch tamer, armed with a silver bullet, attempted to provoke the entity. The spirit responded by physically assaulting the man, pinning him with unseen blows and humiliating him until he fled the property. The entity's power was absolute within the boundaries of the farm. However, its malice was most focused on John Bell. The patriarch began to suffer from a mysterious ailment involving the swelling of his tongue and throat, making it difficult to eat or speak. The spirit would taunt him during these episodes, claiming responsibility for his suffering. While Betsy faced physical abuse, John Bell faced a slow, systematic execution. The entity interfered with his rest, slapped his face until it was swollen, and constantly berated him for his past dealings. It was a relentless campaign of harassment that no amount of medical intervention or spiritual counseling could alleviate. The entity had essentially declared itself the judge, jury, and executioner in a trial where John Bell had no defense attorney and no hope of appeal.
The narrative of the Bell Witch reaches its darkest chapter in the winter of 1820, a period where the entity shifted its focus from general harassment to what can only be described as a calculated assassination of John Bell. As the patriarch's health declined, the spirit's taunts became more vicious and specific, often predicting his impending demise with a glee that disturbed even the most skeptical observers. John Bell suffered from debilitating seizures and a swelling of the throat that made swallowing nearly impossible, a condition that baffled local physicians who were unequipped to handle such anomalous symptoms without the aid of modern medical diagnostics or health insurance coverage. On the morning of December 19, 1820, John Bell lapsed into a stupor from which he would never wake.
When his family searched the medicine cabinet for his prescription, they found instead a strange vial containing a dark, unrecognizable liquid. The discovery of this vial is one of the most critical pieces of physical evidence in the case history. When the family questioned the origin of the bottle, the disembodied voice of the witch immediately claimed ownership, boasting that she had given old Jack a dose of it while he slept to ensure his exit from this world. To test the lethality of the substance, a doctor present at the scene administered a drop of the liquid to the family cat. The animal went into immediate convulsions and died within seconds, proving the substance was a potent toxin. The entity then broke into a raucous celebration, singing drinking songs and declaring victory over the man she had tormented for years. This incident transforms the haunting from a ghost story into a documentation of a supernatural homicide, a wrongful death case where the perpetrator was beyond the reach of any criminal attorney or court of law. The family, grieving and terrified, disposed of the vial in the fireplace, where it reportedly burst into a blue flame, suggesting a chemical composition unknown to the science of that era.
John Bell died on December 20th, 1820, making him the only person in American history whose death is officially attributed to the actions of a spirit by local legend and recorded testimony. The funeral was held 2 days later, and it was one of the largest gatherings in the history of Robertson County, attended by hundreds of people from the surrounding settlements. However, the entity was not finished. As the hearse moved the body to the grave site and the family began the burial process, the witch began to laugh and sing explicitly ribald songs from the air above the mourners. The disruption was so loud and persistent that it drowned out the liturgy of the priest. This final act of desecration solidified the entity's nature as one of pure malice, devoid of the respect for the dead that characterizes even the most hostile human conflicts. The spirit continued to sing until the last shovel of dirt was placed upon the grave, marking the end of John Bell's suffering, but not the end of the haunting. Following the death of the patriarch, the activity in the house decreased significantly, as if the primary objective of the debt collection or vengeance had been achieved. However, the entity promised to return. In 1821, the spirit bade farewell to the family, stating it would leave for 7 years. True to its word, the entity returned in 1828 to haunt John Bell, Jr., engaging him in long theological and political discussions that predicted the American Civil War and the Great Depression with frightening accuracy. These precognitive abilities suggest the entity had access to a non-linear timeline, viewing future financial collapses and national tragedies as established facts. The spirit then departed again, promising to return in 107 years to a direct descendant of the Bell line. This cyclical nature of the haunting implies a curse that functions like a long-term liability, passing down through generations rather than dissipating with the death of the original target. When analyzing the Bell Witch phenomenon through the lens of higher spiritual understanding, it becomes clear that this entity was not a high-ranking deity or a benevolent ancestor. In Buddhist cosmology or advanced spiritual theory, a being that exhibits such attachment to wrath, physical violence, and worldly disputes is likely trapped in the realm of the Asura, demigods of wrath, or a powerful preta, hungry ghost, with significant supernatural powers known as Idti. This spirit was not an enlightened being like an arahant or a bodhisattva, as its actions were rooted in hatred and the infliction of suffering. The entity's ability to manipulate matter and predict the future indicates a high level of spiritual energy, but that energy was corrupted by a vendetta, keeping the spirit bound to the earth plane rather than ascending to a higher state of nirvana or a heavenly realm. The spirit of Kate Batts, or whatever force assumed her name, was likely consumed by the intense negative emotion of the land dispute, creating a psychic imprint strong enough to defy death. As for John Bell, his transition from this life was likely traumatic. Dying in a state of fear and persecution can hinder the consciousness from moving smoothly into the next existence. It is probable that his spirit lingered in a state of confusion or bardo for a time, requiring significant merit and prayer to find peace. The lesson here for the living is profound yet simple. The energy we cultivate in life follows us in death. Conflicts over property, assets, and money can create karmic knots that bind us to the lower realms. We must strive to resolve our disputes with compassion and integrity, ensuring that we do not leave behind a legacy of hatred that can manifest as a curse. The supernatural is not just a story, it is a reflection of our internal states projected into reality. We must live with mindfulness, preparing our minds for the final transition so that we do not become trapped in the cycle of vengeance like the entity that haunted the Red River.